Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Bridge course in English Literature that is offered by the Department of English of Yashwant Mahavidyalaya Nanded. In this video, we are going to talk about a brief history of English fiction. When we look at fiction in 15th century England, the history of English prose fiction in true sense begins with this later half of the 18th century. Of course, there are earlier examples of prose fiction that paved the path for the growth of English fiction in the 18th century. Sir Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, is famously known for the depiction of his imaginary ideal state in his expression titled as Utopia. One of the notable prose writers of this period are Sir Thomas Malory. He is well known for his romance Morte d'Arthur. This romance is based on the legendary English king Arthur and his 12 knights. This work by Malory has inspired many other texts, both in prose, fiction, as well as poetry in the later years in England. Talking about the fiction in 16th century, John Lyly's Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, published in 1579, and Euphues and His England, published in 1580, started the trend of euphemism in the English prose. Euphues was written in the form of letters. This form later was developed by Richardson in the 18th century, called as the epistolary novel. One of the important prose fictions of the Elizabethan period is Thomas Nash's The Unfortunate Traveller, or The Life of Jack Wilton, published in 1594. The fiction in the 17th century credits to John Bunyan. Bunyan's allegorical fiction, The Pilgrim's Progress, published in 1678, is noteworthy to be read. It is an allegorical story of a Christian in search of salvation. It provided to the contemporary English reader a book that could be read along with Bible. This work by Bunyan set a standard in storytelling, in characterization, and also in the dialogue writing. Another work by John Bunyan is The Life and Death of Mr. Bradman, that is published in 1680. This work was designed as the companion of The Pilgrim's Progress. Looking into the fiction in 18th century, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, is worth noting. A Journal of the Plague Year, 1719, followed by another publication of Daniel Defoe called as Moll Flanders. He exposes the impact of the social customs and environment on the characters. In this sense, this novel can be considered as a socio-ecological novel. Due to his contribution to the development of the English novel, Defoe claims a little to be the father of English novel. Samuel Richardson's Pamela, which is also subtitled as Virtue Rewarded, that is published in 1740, claims the title as the first full-length English novel. He wrote Clarissa in 1748. It is the longest novel written in English. Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews began as a satire on Richardson's Pamela, but later on became a trend-setting novel which is known as the picaresque novel. This novel imitates the style of Cervantes' novel Don Quixote. The other novels, like The History of the Life of the late Mr. Jonathan Wild the Great, published in 1743, and Tom Jones, published in 1749. Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones are quite famous, along with Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, representing the fiction in the 18th century. These three great novelists are followed by Laurence Sterne in the same age. Sterne's novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, published in 1677, is the story of a young man, Tristram Shandy, and his uncle Toby. The novel is also one of the finest picaresque novels, which is considered to be wonderful novels by T.S. Eliot and later modern writers. In the 18th century, we have Henry Mackenzie. Through his novel The Man of Feeling, published in 1771, Mackenzie introduced the sentimental novel in England. Oliver Goldsmith's His Vicar of Wakefield, published in 1776, was one of the most popular novels in the 18th century. The Citizen of the World is another sentimental novel by Goldsmith. Horace Walpole introduced the Gothic fiction in the English novel. His The Castle of Otranto set the trend of Gothic fiction, full of suspense, thrill, and horror. Another writer of the Gothic fiction is Mrs. Anne Radcliffe. Her best-known Gothic novels are The Mysteries of Udolpho and The Old Manor House. Talking about the Romantic Age and its fiction, Jane Austen is the representative romantic novelist. Jane Austen wrote many novels like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Mansfield Park, and so on. Jane Austen lived a very restricted provincial life and received little exposure to the Europeans, world artists, and literature. So she is often criticized as being a needlewoman. The subjects of her novel were reduced to young women's finding a husband or matchmaking. Walter Scott, who is also a representative romantic age fiction, is typically called as the historical writer. He represented the history of his country, especially the Scottish history, in his novels such as Guy Mannering, Rob Roy, The Antiquary, Old Morality, and The Bride of Lammermoor. The Victorian age is typically represented by fiction and fiction writers. It is the golden age for fiction with Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Mrs. Gaskell, Charles Reade, and Charles Kingsley. Charles Dickens is very famous for his writings like Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Nicholas Nickleby, Dombey and Sons, and so on. In fact, the paper of English fiction is incomplete without Charles Dickens included in it. His Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Great Expectations are very famous, based on whom or based on which even English films and Hindi films are made. William Thackeray is known as a typical novelist who is famous for writing the novel Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair depicts the social life of the upper middle class London around 1810s. His other novels are Esmond and The Newcomes. Mrs. Gaskell was the wife of an Unitarian minister in Manchester. Mary Barton, published in 1648, Cranford, published in 1853, North and South, published in 1855, and Wives and Daughters, published in 64 to 66 in the 19th century. Credits to Mrs. Gaskell's writing novels. Anne Bronte, who wrote two novels, Agnes Grey and The Tenant of the Wildfield Hall. Charlotte Bronte, the second sister, wrote two novels, Shirley and Jane Eyre, and Jane Eyre is close to the Gothic novel. The third sister, Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights, exactly are the Bronte sisters represented in the Victorian age. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights are masterpieces in English fiction. Followed into the Victorian age, we have another novelist called George Eliot. The actual and the real name of George Eliot is Mary Ann Evans, and she used this pen name of George Eliot to write under the male pen name because of the Victorian age and the support that is given to the male writers and vice versa. Adam Bede, The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marnell, Romola, Felix Holt the Radical, Middlemarch, and Daniel Deronda are beautiful novels that are written by George Eliot. George Meredith is also known for his novels The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, published in 1859, The Adventures of Harry Richmond, published in 1871, Beauchamp's Career, published in 1876, The Egoist, 1879, and Diana of the Crossways, published in 1885, are beautiful novels from the pen of George Meredith. Thomas Hardy is again another representative Victorian writer. His novels include Desperate Remedies, Tests of D'Aurevilliers, Far from the Maddening Crowd, The Trumpet Major, Under the Greenwood Tree, The Return of the Native, Mayor of Casterbridge, and Jude the Obscure. Thomas Hardy is typically a Wessex type of writer, with his regionalism represented in his writings, especially Tess, Mayor of Casterbridge, and Jude the Obscure are beautiful masterpieces from his pen. Talking about the 20th century fiction, the novels of Henry James include Roderick Hudson, The Portrait of a Lady, The Wings of the Dove, The Golden Bowl, and The Ambassador. Of these, James's The Portrait of a Lady is considered as a classical novel. Joseph Conrad, the other important modern fiction writer, his Heart of Darkness, Lord Jim, Nostromo, The Nigger of the Narcissus, and The Secret Agent are very famous. H.G. Wells is primarily known for his science fiction The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, The First Men in the Moon, and The War in the Air. Arnold Bennett is known as the regional novelist. He depicted the town of Berth Hanley and other 5 towns around it, popularly known as the Pottery Towns. The novels of Bennett include Anna of the 5 Towns, The Old Wives' Tale, Clayhanger, Hilda Lessways, and These Twain. Somerset Maugham, who is very famous for writing short stories, also records the changes in the contemporary English life with an eye of an impartial spectator who watches but does not judge. His most famous novel is Of Human Bondage, published in 1915. Other novels include Lisa of Lambeth and Cakes and Ale. E.M. Forster is also known to all the Indian readers for his very famous novel on India and colonization titled as A Passage to India. His other novels include Where Angels Fear to Tread, The Longest Journey, A Room with a View, and Howard's End. E.M. Forster's novels deal with a central subject of the undeveloped heart. Talking about the post-World War fiction, we have James Joyce, as observed in presenting A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Ulysses, followed by The Dubliners. All the 3 novels James Joyce is very famous for. Virginia Woolf used the stream of consciousness technique in her novels like To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway. D.H. Lawrence's novel Sons and Lovers uses the concept of Oedipus complex in treatment of relations between members of the moral family. Other important novels by D.H. Lawrence are Rainbow and its sequence, Women in Love. The other major fiction writers of the modern period are George Orwell, Anthony Burgess, Doris Lessing, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Graham Greene. This video has tried to talk about giving you a historical account of English novels and novelists. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you had enjoyed the session. Bye for now.